Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of my Introduction to Programming with Python course. In this episode we're going to be creating our first sort of actual application that does something mildly more interesting than just displaying text. And in fact I've already made up an example of what we're going to be making just so we can sort of see what we're working towards. So I'm going to open my integrated terminal again and we're just going to quickly clear the screen. Also typed that wrong. Alright, and so I've just put it in a file called example.py, so I'm just going to run that really quick. Okay, so when we run this program, we get given some options. So we've got Ferrari, 2 is Porsche, and 3 is Alfa Romeo. And the question is, what car would we like? So I guess we just put a number in here. So I think, kind of a Porsche guy. So let's hit enter on that. And okay, the cost of a Porsche is $200. Oh, okay, actually, I wonder about the Ferrari now. So I'm going to run the file again, and I'm actually going to say 1. And oh, the cost of the Ferrari is $300. I mean, these are some very cheap cars, it seems, but, we'll take the deal. Anyways, what you can see here is basically we're taking user input and also doing some thinking with it to display some different output depending on what the user inputs. So it's a bit of a level up on the last few things we've been doing, which is just like static linear scripting. So let's jump into looking at how we're going to do that. But first of all, we're going to fix this little terminal issue. So if you're a Windows user, follow along here for this part. If you're not on Windows, just you can skip ahead a bit. But anyways, so if you're on Windows, you want to go File, Preferences, Settings. And then once the settings opens up, there's a search bar at the top. You just want to search for default terminal. And then we're going to scroll through, because there's a lot of settings here. We're going to try and scroll through until we find a setting, which it might not have showed up in this one just yet. I might have to do for a different search. Okay, let's try different. Let's search for terminal default. Okay, because what we're trying to find is this thing here. So it's a setting called Terminal Integrated Default Profile Windows. And we're just going to set that to command prompt. So that means every time, and just Control S to save that setting. And that just means that we'll actually default to using command prompt instead of PowerShell, which is what we want. Okay, so that's that out of the way. Now to the programming. Okay, so here is the file as we left off in the last episode, and we're actually just going to nuke this whole thing. If you want, you can create a new file and work on it for this episode, but I'm just going to work out the same one, and I'm going to delete everything that was already there. And I'm going to show you a new language feature. So in Python and in every programming language, there's pretty much always a way of leaving something called a comment. So obviously with large code files and a lot of different things going on, you can imagine that things can get quite complex. And so sometimes it can be useful to leave little notes to yourself to explain how a certain part of the code works. And that's particularly useful if you're learning, because it can help you understand, what did I do here, and like, why do I have to do it that way? So using the little hash symbol here, right, we can create something called a comment. So it's like a hashtag like on social media. Okay, so I have now created a comment. And basically what this means is when the Python interpreter starts reading through our file top to bottom and trying to work out what to do, if it sees one of these, it's just going to ignore the rest of the line. So basically it just goes, oh, there's a hash symbol, so anything after it for the rest of that line doesn't matter. And so basically it's a way of writing text that isn't code so that we can get some information. Okay, so let's look at our example program again down here and think about what we need to do, because a big part of thinking like a programmer is just breaking down the process into usable steps. So let's use our comments to write down what steps we need to do. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is probably, I guess, show the user what car options we have. So show car options. Again, this isn't code, these are just comments, so we can refer back to them as we're programming to work out what we need to do next. The next thing we do is get the user input. So let's type get user input. And then the last thing is display the cost of the chosen vehicle. So display cost of selection. Okay, so as you can see, we've broken it down into sort of 3 relatively simple steps. And I think, if you've been following along with the first 2 videos, you probably know how to do both of these already. We've got a print statement, we've got an input statement. But this last one, maybe not so much, but we're going to get there. Okay, so let's start working through our list in order of the problem-solving steps. So the first thing we need to do is show the car options. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're just going to use our trusty little print statement. Now, there is better ways of doing this in the future, but for now, we're just going to hard code it like this, and because it's easy to understand and we've seen these features. So we're going to print, and we've got to think about what options we want. So, I don't know. Let's keep the Ferrari. I like Ferraris, so let's do that. Okay, so all we've done here, again, you'll recall, we're using our print statement, and then we're putting a string into the print statement saying, hey, this text here, because it's between quotes, I want you to treat it just as is. Okay, so anything between the quotes just gets treated just as pure text and will get displayed. So that's our first option. So I'm just going to copy that line, just Control C and Control V, or Command C and V on Mac. All right, and let's create our second option. So now, I don't know, let's go, I don't know, Honda, okay? Depending on where you're from, you might not know what a Honda is, but, that's another brand we can put. And then let's get one other option. Let's go for, how about a Lambo, like a Lamborghini, but no one really knows how to spell it, so we'll just use the abbreviation. Now, we'll make sure that we actually change this here, because we want our user to actually be able to know which is which. So now we've got Ferrari is option 1, Honda is option 2, and Lambo is option 3. Okay, so that is our first step here. Done. Okay, so we've shown the car options to the screen. So if we save this file, now remember when you see the dot in VS Code, that means it's not saved. So doing Control S and saving the file, now it's saved. If we come down here and run it, so using our Python space and then the file name, which is program.py in this case, because that's what we named our file, and hitting enter, cool. You see that we've got our car options being displayed to the screen. All right, so next step, get user input. So here, you see we asked what car would you like? And then the user was able to input a number corresponding to one of the options. So how can we do that? Well, in the last episode, we learned about the input. So let's use input. What car, whoops, it would help if I could spell correctly, would you like? Now, you may have noticed in the last episode that I put a space after the question mark here. That's because if you don't put a space here, when it gets printed to the screen, the user input gets jammed right up against it and it just looks kind of ugly. So just leaving a little bit of space means that their input will have a gap between your question and that input. So saving this file again and running it, you'll see that we've got Ferrari, Honda, Lambo. What car would you like? Okay, we can put in a number and hit enter. Obviously, nothing else happens now because we're not doing anything with the input, but we're just getting the general steps out. So we've got the user input. Now, one thing you might have noticed as I'm quickly running the program, I'm using the up arrow on my keyboard to basically cycle back to the last command we put in, which basically allows me to just quickly type it in again. And that should work on whatever terminal you're using. So using the up and down arrows, you can scroll through the history of commands that you've put into the terminal. All right, so what do we have to do next? Okay, so we got the user input, so I guess we're going to call that done. And all right, that's cool. That's to display the cost of selection. Okay, well, how are we going to do that though? Because presumably each of these cars costs a slightly different amount. So how are we going to know what thing to display to the screen? And that's where the first sort of major programming concept that we'll cover in this course comes in, which is if statements. So an if statement is a form of conditional statement. Now, there's a lot of big words here, but basically it's just a way of making decisions. So let's just add another comment. Conditional statements are ways to make decisions, like so, okay? So how does an if statement in Python work? Well, let's write one. Okay, so we're going to start with the if keyword, okay? So just if, all right, now what? Okay, so we're going to do something here. So the way an if statement works is it basically, and don't type this just yet, I'm just putting this in as a reference, all right? We're going to see the way an if statement works is generally we'll say if a certain condition is met, then run the code on the following line, right? And that's sort of the general shape of what an if statement looks like. So if some condition is met, then run the code on the next line. Okay, so what are we really testing for here then? Well, I guess, and I don't know what this is here for, I'll get rid of that in a moment, but I guess what we're testing for is what number the user has put in. So how do we check that? Well, we need a way of storing what the user put in for the first place. So if you're an astute watcher, you may have noticed that we didn't create a variable for the input. So it's just getting thrown into the void right now. So we need to store the user input. So let's call the variable choice for whatever the user chose and set it equal to input. Okay, so coming down here to our condition block, all right, we're going to say if choice. And think about how we might talk in English. In English, we might say like, oh, if choice is Honda, then do this. So we can try and do that, and Python actually does have an is keyword. However, it's going to cause us some issues in this case, so we're not going to use it. The way we do it in programming is use an equal sign, but in fact, actually two equals signs. So I'll type it first and I'll explain it in a moment. So we're going to say if choice equals 1, and then on this line here, we're going to say print user chose Ferrari. Okay, now I'll explain this because it's a lot going on here. So basically, let's walk through this again. We show the options to the screen, and then we collect the user input and store it in a variable called choice. Then we come down to our if statement, and we're saying if choice, if what the user input equals 1. Now, why do we use equals and not just equals 1? Well, the reason is, in Python, the equal sign is reserved for assigning values to variables. If we have a single equals here, when Python tries to read this file, it gets confused because it doesn't know if it's trying to compare choice with 1 or if it's trying to store the value of 1 inside choice. So to avoid the confusion, and this is the same in almost every programming language you'll encounter, we use two equal signs. So we're saying if choice is equal to 1. We're not setting choice equal to 1. We're saying we're asking is it equal to 1. Okay, so let's have a look here. If choice equals 1. Okay, so in other words, if the user put in a number that's equal to 1, then we're going to print user chose Ferrari. Awesome. So let's try running this program and see what happens. I'm just going to delete this. I think Visual Studio Code was trying to get smart and put some extra code in that we didn't need. Okay, so I'm going to come down here. I'm going to use CLS to clear my terminal. Again, use clear if you're on a terminal, if you're on Linux or a Mac. All right, and then I'm going to run my program with Python. Python program.py. Okay. All right. So which car would we like? Let's get the Honda. You know, it's more affordable. It's in our price range. So if we say 2 and hit enter, well, nothing happens. And that's good. We actually wouldn't expect anything to happen because remember, right now we're only checking if the user chose the first option. We have no case for if the option is 2 or 3 or whatever. We are only checking, hey, if the user specifically chose 1, then do this. Otherwise, nothing else happens. Okay, so that's a bit of a problem. So we need to be able to also check if the Honda or the Lambo is picked. So let's, copy this. Maybe we can copy our code. It's pretty common, and we'll paste it down here, and we'll say, well, okay, if the choice is equal to 2, then the user must have chosen a Honda. Okay, that's cool. And then we'll sort of come down here and paste another line and say, oh, okay, if the choice is 3, then the user must have, picked what's our last option? A Lambo. And this will work. If choice equals 1, then this code gets run. If choice equals 2, then this code gets run. And if choice equals 3, then this code gets run. Now, there are two key things we're going to learn here. The first one that I want to point out, because I forgot to just before, is that yes, there is a reason why I have indented my code here. Python cares about indentation. So if I just put this on the next line and don't indent it at all, right, and try and run it, you'll see we get an error. And it's an indentation error expected and an indented block after the if statement on line 14, which is this. So what has happened here? Well, Python uses the level of indentation as a way of knowing what statement we're inside, okay? So it's a little bit nebulous concept. So for what you need to know now, I mean, in most cases, your Visual Studio will sort of automatically put you on new lines and things like that. But generally, what we're using is, say we want to put codes inside an if block, then we use a tab to indent it a level, okay? So we can also add another print statement here, say print, this is another print statement, for example, and save this. And now both of these lines of code will run when choice is equal to 1. In fact, we can keep going and add as many lines as we want. And if it's the same level of indentation, so if it's one level of indentation, it's considered to be underneath this if statement. Now, I don't particularly like this choice because I think it isn't very clear or obvious to beginners how this works, but it is important. Basically, code that works in the same block, in the same flow, needs to be at the same indentation level. So because all of this is indented underneath this if statement, this code is considered to be inside the outside if statement. It's, you know, a bit nebulous, right? Now, if we look here, this is indented under this if statement. So this code here is considered to be inside this if statement, right? So it's a bit nebulous. Now, if we indent one of these lines too much, Python also complains because now it's saying, well, how come you've indented twice? It doesn't know how to handle that. So it's really fussy about it. Like I say, for the most part, your code editor will handle it. But sometimes if you get an indentation error, it's complaining because it means some line is too indented or not indented enough. And they have to be exactly aligned. That's a really important distinction that other programming languages don't work like. So I recommend, if you're using Visual Studio or probably like Atom, whatever code editor you're using, to do the indenting and to make sure that that's all the same, use the tab key on your keyboard. It will always indent everything an equal number of spaces, okay? So using the tab key will always indent your code the same way. So that way we can avoid any collisions or any slight misalignments or anything like that. So using the tab key to create blocks of code, okay? So let's just delete these unnecessary lines here. It's a bit much. The other thing I want to talk about is we can actually simplify this logic a little bit. So, apart from just using an if statement in Python, there is also an else if statement. Now, it's elif. It's kind of weird. It's a little bit, it's not really a word, but elif. Okay, so let's change these bottom two to elifs and see what happens. Okay, now let's think about what this is doing. Okay, if the user's choice, basically, so if whatever is stored in this choice variable, if choice equals 1, then in this indented block, we're going to run this code. Else, if the choice is 2. In other words, if this is not the case, right, but this is the case, so else if. Okay, so if this is not right, then let's try this one, and let's try this one. That's what else if does. So when we have if, like this does work, and the difference is that when we do it this way, the program will go and say, okay, if the choice is 1, then do this, and then it will check, okay, if the choice is 2, do this. And then down here, you know, if this was also just an if statement, it would check, okay, if the choice is 3, then do this. Now, the problem is, it's not necessarily a big deal for a simple program like this, but it's not necessarily super clean. And what I mean by clean is like good programming practice. And it can also cause some very minor, albeit performance issues, because it has to check every single time. Okay, I've got to check if it's 1, and now I've got to check if it's 2, and now I've got to check if it's 3. But if we know the user input is 1, then why do we have to check if it's 2 or 3? Because we know it's not. So that's why we use an else if statement. So basically saying, else if the last statement wasn't true, then try this one. Right? And an else if can only ever be used after an if statement. You can't just use an else if by itself. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So our program flow with our conditional statements now saying, okay, if choice equals 1, use this indented block. Else, if choice equals 2, use this indented block. Else, if choice equals 3, use this indented block. So, you know, that's a bit better, as we can see, and okay, that's cool. So let's run it, because this should work now, right? We print the options, we get the user input, and then we display, well, we haven't quite done the cost of selection, but we display some output based on what the choice is. So let's do that and see what happens. Okay, let's get the Ferrari. Okay, so again, I'm just down here in the bottom line of my terminal, so if that's a bit hard to see, and hit enter, and nothing happens. So let's clear the screen and run it again. You know, oh, did we save our file? Oh, well, we didn't save our file, so that's part of the problem. So let's save it. I actually know what is wrong here, but we're going to work through it together and see if we can work it out. So let's run it again. Okay, what car would you like? Ferrari. And still nothing happens. So what's happening? Why are we not seeing it? Well, remember in last episode where I banged on about data types and, you know, kept going on about different types and whatever? This is the reason why I talked about it. Because right now, what this is saying is if the value inside choice is equal to the integer 1. But by default, text-based information that we provide input is stored as a string. So that's the thing. In Python, it's not obvious that that's the case. But actually, choice here will be a string variable because we're entering text into the terminal, right? So it's sort of a bit of a nebulous idea. Okay, so what does that really mean for us? Like, how is that helpful? Okay, so let's go down here. Okay, let's create a new variable called let's create a new variable called converted. Okay, so remember, creating a variable, we just put the name and then what it's equal to. Okay, and let's say, and I'll explain this in a second, we're going to type int, and then we're going to open a bracket and close a bracket, and then inside it we're going to type choice. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Now, what does this do? Okay, so when we collect input from the user and store it in choice, because we're collecting text-based information, choice is a string type, and you can actually see hovering over it that Visual Studio is telling us that this is an str or a string type. So what we've had to do is collect some text data and store it in a variable, which is then obviously going to be a string because it's text data. But down here, we are comparing choice to an integer. Now, a string is never going to be the same thing as an integer, which means this code is never going to run because it's not going to be the case. In Python, a string of 1, which is what's getting inputted, that does not ever equal an integer of 1. These are different data types, so they cannot be equal. So what we're going to do instead is use this thing called a type conversion. So I'm going to add a little comment here. Type conversion. And this allows us to convert from a string data type into an integer. Okay, so we do that by basically just wrapping choice in an integer conversion, right? And it literally just looks like that. It's int followed by an open bracket and a closed bracket. Okay, and so this code basically takes choice and it tries to convert it into an integer. So now, if we check if the converted value is equal to these things, then we should see our code working properly. Like so. Okay, so saving this and running the code, we can just choose Ferrari, and you can see user chose Ferrari because we did. Because what it's done is it's correctly converted it, and now it's checking, okay, well, it is an integer that is 1, and so we'll print this indented statement. So, there's a lot going on here. This might be a simple program, but there's already so many concepts. We've got if statements and if-else statements and type conversion and collecting user input and all sorts going on. And we can simplify this just one last stage. If we know that the user is always going to input a number because our program is asking them to choose a number, then we can just immediately convert the input to an integer. So if you actually wrap the entire input statement, this, in an integer conversion, right, which it looks like int and then open bracket and close bracket at the end. Now make sure that your brackets are balanced. So we've got one opening, two opening brackets. So then we've got one closing, two closing brackets. That's really important. Then we can actually get rid of this line because choice is now going to be an integer because we're converting it before storing it. So we're converting the input into an integer and then storing it. So now we can go back to our original code, which was just checking if the choice was equal to a certain number. Perfect. So now running our code again, for last time, let's choose the Lambo, and you can see user chose Lambo. So yeah, we've got essentially the same functionality as was shown in the example. We've sort of worked it through and got it working. And I'll show you the example code. It's exactly the same thing as what we've just done, just with dollar values. So that's how we do it. Now, in the next episode, we're going to go into a little bit more depth as to how you can work out what data types certain things are and how to know if you have to convert between them or not. And we're also going to look at something called the Python REPL or REPL, which is a way of interacting with Python like it's a command prompt. So we can test things out before writing them in a script. So thank you for watching. I know it might have been a lot of new concepts, but I hope you're able to follow along. And don't worry, because we're going to continue unpacking and looking at these different concepts in future videos. All right, cheers. See you in the next one.